Well, hi, it's Michael McQueen here. Welcome back to this next installment of the Meet the Experts series. I have loved these conversations where I get the chance to speak one-on-one, very conversational, relaxed tone with some of the researchers and thinkers who've most influenced my most recent book, Mindstuck. And I'm thrilled today to have the one and only Steven Sloman dialing in for the call. Now, many of you won't need an intro for him at all, but for those who haven't come across his work, firstly, you're in for a treat. And secondly, here's just a little bit of a bio or background for Steven, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So Steven Sloman is a cognitive scientist with a PhD from Stanford and has been teaching at Brown University since 1992. His research explores how our thought patterns shape our view of the world, decision-making, and communication. He's authored a brilliant book called The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone. How's that for a title? And his work is featured in publications such as The New Yorker and The New York Times. He has editorial experience as the former editor-in-chief of Cognition and currently serves on the editorial board of Decision and Psychological Science. So welcome to the conversation, Steven. Thank you for making the time.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Michael. I wish my book were as engaging and full of information as yours.
Well, you're very kind and very modest, I must say. I would suggest people get a copy of it because, I mean, a lot of the themes that I'm keen to unpack in this discussion, because I learned a number of terms from you, things that I hadn't heard before. And as I read the terms, I thought that so perfectly describes something that I'd seen, that I've picked up on, but didn't really have words to put around it. So one of those terms was collective cognition. And I love that idea. So would you mind just unpacking what that is, and how does it shape the way that we as humans reason and think and arrive at points of judgment?
The sense in which I use the term is as a different way of thinking about how the mind works, right? So generally, people think about the mind as sitting inside the brain, but in my view, the mind is that element of human beings that processes information, that reasons, that comes to decisions, that thinks. And I actually think that process is collective. It involves other people in a couple of senses. It involves other people in the sense that we collaborate with others. You and I are collaborating right now so that the conclusions we reach are conclusions that depend on both of our contributions to the conversation, right? So there's a real collaborative enterprise. It, in some sense, wouldn't make sense to try to completely separate my contribution from your contribution. What does Michael think versus what does Steven think? Because you're responding to what I say, and I'm responding to what you say, and what we say is a joint enterprise. So collaboration is one aspect of collective cognition, but another is what you might call cultural cognition, right? The fact that we make use of knowledge that resides in our culture.
And do you find that then, does this lead into what we're seeing right now from a tribalism perspective, that we tend to, rather than engage with issues reasonably, openly, we tend to defer to, like, what's the hive mind, our collective group who think like us or who we identify with or feel we belong to? Does it then feed into that? Because that certainly seems to be one of the dominant themes, I mean, right across society and in business right now as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, tribalism is very, very closely related to collective cognition in exactly that sense. And, it's not even clear to me that it's a fashion so much as a fact about humans. We've always been tribal in that sense. It's true that it's dominating a lot of our political culture now in a way that perhaps it hasn't so much in the past. But it definitely reflects both of these aspects, our tendency to collaborate, and we live in these silos, so we collaborate with people who have the same point of view as we do often, and when they don't, we often get into fights, right, and don't produce anything. And we depend, very much, say, on values that those around us have, that members of our tribe, that members of our collective. In the knowledge illusion, I refer to it as our community, right? And I talked about the community of knowledge, that when you talk about the knowledge someone has, what you're really talking about is the set of knowledge that people within their community, and today, we might say tribe, possess and make use of.
So, which is interesting because I mean, we've seen so many examples in the last few years of when, particularly in organizations, when groupthink sets in and everyone just toes the line, agrees with what those in power or what the common consensus is around an issue. That's often when things start to get messy. That's when ethical boundaries are crossed and all the rest of it. So you've got that as what I guess the shadow side of this, because you see that dangerous grouping that can emerge. But then you've also got, and I see this every single day with my corporate clients. I'll talk about, we want to have a team where everyone feels psychologically safe to speak up, to share dissenting views, to challenge the status quo, challenge, what we, your leaders, are saying. But the reality is, from what I've seen in your research, that's incredibly difficult to do because we've got this incredible compulsion to defer to the group, to that group consensus. So, any tips for leaders who are trying to address that and encourage like genuine collaboration through diverse thinking within a team?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the way I think about it is that it's very natural for us to join in the group culture and to try not to make waves. And there's a sense in which the great advances in our civilization have come in the form of methods of breaking that tendency towards groupthink, right?
Yeah.
Like the development of law is essentially the development of an adversarial system in which, two points of view, two stories really, are pitted against one another. And that's a method of winnowing out the truth.
Yep.
Similarly in academia, right? So the culture that says we should argue about stuff is kind of unnatural. It's something that we've had to, foster and generate norms which say it's okay. Or, peer review, which is the basic process by which stuff gets published in science, has the same quality. We're going to create a system in which we pit people against each other because it's sort of unnatural. So we have to create the institution which makes it possible to happen. So do I have advice for leaders? Well, I guess one piece of advice is be careful of your own hubris, right? So that's the first thing. So I think one reason people tend to have hubris, i.e., they tend to think they know more than in fact they do, is because they're representing a group, and the group might actually have a lot of knowledge. But if you want to foster and encourage different points of view, then you have to be aware of how limited what you personally bring to the table is, in order to allow yourself and allow others to learn from other people who are around.
It's interesting. I don't know if this is useful language from your side, but I know when I work with clients, I'll talk about that fine line between having a cohesive culture and a conformist culture. And one is healthy and one is not. And often they look very similar to each other. And that's the challenging thing, is a strong cohesive culture can become conformist depending on how the leader leads. So I mean, I think that's it's a timely message around arrogance or hubris, and how easily that develops, particularly in a leader when you've been the leader for a while and there's been success. It's easy to start to read your own press and believe what everyone says about you. In terms of leaders who want to try and encourage those they are leading to not get locked into ways of thinking that aren't serving them or the organization well, there's something, and I'm pretty sure it was in the knowledge illusion that you talked about, this idea of get people to take their ideas and almost like extrapolate them out, like think about the practical outworkings of their ideas. And that's a good way to try and encourage people not to get fixed in extreme notions. Have I remembered that correctly? Is that something you spoke about in the knowledge illusion? If so, could you just unpack that a little bit? How do you do that?
So I wonder if what you're referring to is the illusion of understanding.
I think it was, yeah.
we've run a lot of experiments where we give people an object, any kind of causal system, right? So it could be a pen, which is a causal system in a way, or ask them about toilets, or ask them about political policies, which are also causal systems. And we say, how well do you understand how they work? And people tend to think they understand how ballpoint pens and scissors work, right? But then when we say, okay, explain to me in as much detail as you can how it works, people discover that their explanations are not very satisfactory.
Yeah.
The process of explaining kind of reveals the limits of their knowledge. And so often what happens is the attempt to explain reveals to people they don't understand as well as they thought, and their sense of understanding declines, and also the extent to which they're tied to a perspective on the issue also declines. So they become more open-minded in a sense.
That is definitely what I remembered. I love that idea of if you get people to almost speak it out, try and explain what they think they know for sure, they get to a point where they're like, it's hard to take a firm stand on shaky ground. And if you suddenly realize you don't understand something you thought you had all sorted out in your mind, that as long as, I guess, there's a fine line there between getting people to a point where they realize, actually, I don't understand this the way I thought I did. Maybe I'm open to a different perspective, without pushing people to the point where they get embarrassed. And then, of course, they shut down and all the rest of that seems like a tricky one, but I mean, it can be incredibly powerful as a technique.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the fine line you have to walk between making people feel bad about themselves because they don't understand, versus revealing to people that in fact there are limits to their knowledge.
So I think the example of that I remember reading about in something, and it could have even been your book, was there was a series of surveys done with people about what American foreign policy should be in the Ukraine. And so this was pre the whole Ukraine-Russia crisis we're experiencing right now. So this is about 5 years ago, I believe. And so people who had the strongest views about what America should do with the Ukraine had the least understanding of where it was on a map. Because when they were then asked, can you place Ukraine on a map? Those who were absolutely certain about how the US should engage didn't really know where it was. And it was funny, even that process of them realizing they didn't even know where the country was on a map made them at least open up enough to go, well, maybe I'm not so sure about what we should do here. And I think there is such value in that if it's done in a way that preserves dignity and doesn't embarrass people and the rest of it. I love that concept of getting people to extrapolate out and explain their beliefs. And I think there is something in that it's useful whether you're talking about in a social context, in a family context, in a work context. The last thing I was keen to pick up on, and you flagged this before, and I find this personally so interesting. It's something I think I'll return to in a future book, because there's not a lot that's been done on this that I can find, but I think it's so interesting, this distinction between the mind versus the brain. Because we so often hear those words used synonymously. In fact, yesterday I was watching the recently rebooted Magic School Bus show with my youngest son, which is on Netflix, and it's brilliant, super educational. But they were doing an episode yesterday on the way the brain worked, and so it had neurons and synapses and all the rest of it, made simple for kids, but still very scientific in its approach. And I noticed, I reckon in the space of 2 minutes, they used the word brain and mind interchangeably about 40 times. And we see that so often is the case. You talked about the distinction between the brain versus the mind. Can you just unpack that a little bit more? And what are the implications for that on the way we understand how we actually think as humans?
Look, I have a strong but perhaps minority view on this, because both lay people and a lot of scientists who study this stuff actually do see the two as kind of interchangeable, which I consider a huge mistake. And so here's why. So we know what the brain is, right? It's this, piece of wetware, this sort of, I guess it's not quite meat. It's this bunch of neurons that are stuck together with a bunch of, hormones and membranes and neurotransmitters and stuff. And we know where to find it, right? You open up the skull. It's not clear where it begins and ends. Like you could ask, are the eyes part of the brain, right?
Yeah.
Not so clear. Spinal cord, maybe a little clearer. But anyway, we have a pretty good sense of what the brain is. Well, what's the mind? And in my view, the mind is the thing that processes information. The mind is the thing that does tasks that are assigned to it, right? So there's this well-known cognitive scientist who was at UC San Diego for a long time, who points out that the general belief, both amongst lay people and amongst most psychologists, cognitive scientists, certainly neuroscientists, is that the mind sits in the brain, right? In fact, he points out, exactly the opposite is true. So in fact, the right way to think about it is that the brain is in the mind.
It really does open up the scope for understanding exactly, what it is that makes us up as humans, and like what makes up, literally makes up our minds. What is it that constitutes our mind? And I think, and I picked some of this up from your work. There's another great book by a neuroscientist at Oxford named Sharon Dirks, and she wrote a great book a little while back called "You Are Not Your Brain," and it's this whole notion that, outside of the brain being the physical hardware doing the thinking, you've got, notions of consciousness, the soul, even intuition. Like, how many things do we know that we know that we know them? You can't pin that down to a cognitive function happening in our brain. It's something that we just, in our gut, almost in our bones, we know that to be true. And so much of our thinking happens in ways that you can't just, measure on a functional MRI scan. So I was so curious to see what your sense was, because to me, this is going to be something we spend a lot of time in the next 10 years looking at, potentially undoing some of the things we thought we knew about how the brain worked, that we've formed in the last 20 or 30 years of neuroscience.
The question is, when you try to develop theories about how the brain is involved in mental processes, right? In vision, in reasoning, in decision making, etc. That's when I think claims about the brain are going to be shown to be insufficient. But it's not just bodies. Like, if you think about outrage, right? What's important about a response like outrage is what it signals to other people. So your outrage at seeing someone else's behavior is revealing about how morally appropriate you think that behavior is. And that is informative to other people. So, back to this question of our polarized society and the culture wars. Well, one thing that happens is this joint shared feeling of outrage, right? So everybody has this bodily reaction, and everybody starts interpreting things in some way by virtue of the fact that some people are. So the whole notion of collective cognition suggests that the mind, right, the thing that is forcing the processing of information, isn't just happening in a single brain. Maybe it's happening in multiple brains, but I think that it's more than that, right? It's also the physical environment in which things happen that are critical to determining the final outcome.
Well, I imagine anyone listening in has got a very clear sense now of why I've so appreciated your work and your contribution, just the way you think about this stuff. For those who want to find out more about you and your work, where's the best place for them to seek you out online?
I have a web page that if they Google Sloman Lab, SLOMANLAB, they should find my Google site, which is not a very fancy web page, but it has links to all kinds of interviews and videos and podcasts that I've done. In fact, hopefully this one will appear on it in the not too distant future.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you again for making the time. Fantastic to chat. And I personally look forward to following your work as well. I appreciate you making the time. Cheers.